Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's meeting of the Scrutiny Commission. As usual, this meeting is being broadcast live to the public. For those not able to watch live, the webcast will be recorded and made available for viewing on the County Council's website after this meeting. We have had apologies from Mrs. Fryer, who's being substituted by Mr. Smith, Vice Chair of the Children and Families Scrutiny Committee. And therefore we move on to item 1, which is the minutes from the last meeting, which were held on the 30th of January 2023. I move that these are taken as read, confirmed and signed. Is that agreed? Okay, which moves on to item 2, which is question time, and we haven't received any questions from the public. So moving on to item 3, questions asked by members under Standing Order 7. I've not received any such questions. Item 4, we have no urgent items. So item 5 is declarations of interest in respect of items on the agenda. Do any members have any interest they wish to declare? No? Okay. Item 6 is declaration of the party whip. Do any members wish to declare the party whip? No. Item 7, we've not received any petitions, so that moves us on to the first substantial item, which is item 8, the SEND Service and Finance Update, which starts on page 13 of your agenda pack. So we have quite a few officers and other members joining us today for this item. Jane Moore, Director of Children and Family Services, is introducing the paper, and she is joined by Anne Carruthers, Director of Environment and Transport, and Chris Tambini, Director of Corporate Resources. We're also joined by Mrs. Taylor, the lead member for Children and Family Services, Mr. O'Shea, the lead member for Environment and Transport, and Mr. Brecken, the lead member for Resources. So welcome everyone to the meeting. The Vice Chair and spokespersons for the Children and Families and Highway and Transport Overview and Scrutiny Committees have also been invited to attend and join the discussion for this item. And welcome to Mr. Bill, who's joined us in the meeting as well. The Commission has agreed, given the length and breadth of the report, to take this in sections. So we will pause as we go through the papers at appropriate stages to deal with each of the parts of the report. So if I hand over to you, Jane, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. So the report that we've set out for you today gives an overview of the provision of support provided by the Council to children and young people with special educational needs and disability, following a request made by this Commission at its meeting in November 22. So it sets out the position around the current SEND services, the finances, an update on the programme that's looking at resolving the issue around financial pressures and the wider impacts on SEND transport services as well. Just moving to paragraph 14, an overview around the finances. In relation to high needs funding, local authorities receive the High Needs Dedicated Schools Grant for the purpose solely of funding places for children with special educational needs and services that support them. And there are a number of those within the local authority. The level of grant that's allocated to Leicestershire is calculated using a national formula, and part of determining the factors around the formula, the DfE did take a policy decision not to use the number of education, health and care plans in order to avoid authorities using the number of plans to influence their funding allocations. The DfE has given local authorities their working assumptions of the annual increase of 3%, and whilst the grant allocations for 24-25 onwards are uncertain, this is the assumption that we've been used to factor into the MTFS. So the high needs DSG can only be used to support expenditure defined within the finance regulations, and local authorities are only able to contribute to the grant with the permission of Secretary of State and are required to carry forward any surplus or deficit on the grant into future years. And in adding to the high needs DSG or other blocks of the DSG, we can also that can also contribute to the DSG reserved, and notably the funding revenue for the growth in schools, which is what we've been using as part of the reserve. And the DfE judge an authority's financial performance by the overall DSG deficit, not just the high needs DSG deficit. So in relation to the high needs financial position in Leicestershire, we've recorded a deficit on the high needs element of the DSG now since 2018-19, and it's predicted that we will continue to do so over the period of the MTFS. So if I can take you to the table at the top of page 16, you can see that the high needs dedicated school grant is around 105 million, going up to 114 million over the period of the MTFS. And the annual revenue funding gap on that grant after savings and expenditure remains at around about 13 to 11 million over the period of the MTFS, which results in a cumulative high needs funding gap of 90 million at the end of the MTFS. This is a significant national issue, not just impacting Leicestershire, and the DfE has established now a 3-tier intervention or support programme for authorities across the country around DSG deficits. Leicestershire is in the kind of second tier of that intervention, so we are one of the 55 authorities that's been invited to be part of the Delivering Better Value in SEND programme, and we're in the first of 3 tranches of that programme. The DfE have set out requirements for local authorities to maintain a management plan to recover the DSG, and in Leicestershire this is being delivered through the High Needs Development Plan, which is now the Transforming Send and Inclusion programme. So whilst the Transforming Send and Inclusion programme, which I'll talk a little bit later, will deliver some of the savings outside of the current MTFS period, the financial position that we're currently in but continue to be in remains unsustainable and is the most significant risk for the council. Most notably around the DSG and DSG expenditure, particularly around high needs, the cost of SEND placements in mainstream school and special schools and enhanced resource bases and independent schools accounts for 90% of the total expenditure on the high needs block, and the remaining 10% funds some of the services that we deliver, both within schools but also within the local authority. And for 23-24, the expenditure that we're projecting is 118% of the high needs DSG.
Thank you. If I'll take over then moving on to SEND Transport. Unlike the position that Jane's just outlined for you in terms of funding, for the transport element, we do not get any dedicated grants. This comes out of LCC's revenue budget. Eligibility for a child depends on having that EHCP, and within that EHCP then being allocated a setting that they're going to, whereby we're required to transport them. So over specific distances for primary age and secondary age. We currently transport just over 2,500 children, so it isn't, the whole cohort of children, SEND children, that the authority is looking after. The table at the top of page 18 sets out the cost for the service since 2018-19 and forecast forward to the end of the MTFS period. And you'll see from that for a number of years that we've seen a trend of increasing numbers and increasing complexity, both these factors have driven up the cost substantially of the SEND transport service. Forecast for the MTFS period, however, going forward, we're only forecasting 2% increase in terms of complexity of need. But it is the continued growth in numbers coming through the system that is seeing such a growth in the overall budget for this area in terms of transport. That complexity comes down to things like the need for solo transport, the need for medically trained escorts, the need for specific types of vehicles because of size of wheelchair, etc., etc. There's a number of factors that drives up that cost. You'll see the budget for this year, we had 18 million. However, I'll just caveat that and say at the moment we're forecasting a 2.3 million overspend on that, primarily down to the difficult market conditions, the cost, the inflation elements on both labour and fuel, and as a result of that, we've seen this year substantial numbers of contract handbacks. We don't normally get that. There'll be a few in any one year, but the numbers this year have far exceeded anything we've seen. The report says, it's in the 90s. However, that was, I think, to the end of December, and we're now over 150 contracted handbacks. When we get them handed back, we have to re-tender, and when we re-tender, I'm sure it won't be a surprise to see that the costs come in considerably higher there. You also see that when it comes to the end of the MTFS period, we're forecasting a budget of up to 25 million. So again, substantial increase driven by those numbers that we're continuing to grow. The other thing I will point out on just that table before I hand back to Jane is the annual cost per user. We see that kind of plateauing out over the time. Now, predominantly, we're doing a substantial amount of work in the department about how we manage this growth in cost across the service area. And it's looking about how we review the service, how we drive efficiency in the service, things like occupancy of vehicles, whether we deliver in-house or by the external market, whole host of factors and activities and work streams going on there that we're seeking to really begin to try and manage the level of growth that we see over that budget overall. I'll stop and hand back to Jane.
So Chair, we propose pausing there in order to take questions around the finances. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jane and Anne. Do members have any questions on that? Simon.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. First of all, can I welcome this report? I think it's very, very useful. And the real benefit of it is it pulls together both the transport and the children and young people service. And we've got two directors here for the price of one. We can do this as the commission, whereas the not ordinary, but the standard committees just look at their areas. So I thought it was important, and I know a number of other members did, to be able to look at the whole picture. I can't remember, probably been here too long, but originally transport was in what was the education department, and then it got moved in and separated out into transport. I don't know what the benefit, I guess I bet people who deal with education would rather not have to deal with transport. But on the other hand, the benefit is you get transport specialists then. So just be interested in the comments, because it does mean that you have to work very, very closely together, don't you? Once the outcome of the ECHP is known, then transport can make the arrangements. Anne commented, said it's basically statutory, which is, I think, is it the 2 miles primary and 3 miles? That's it. It's the same as for mainstream, is it? Okay, so it's helpful to know what triggers the need for transport. But it does seem to me with these that what we're actually doing is spending millions and millions of pounds busing children or taxiing children around the county to get to the provision, and that just can't be in the best interest of the budget. Probably not the most important issue, but the one we're trying to address today. It certainly can't be in the interests of the young people that are sitting in taxis twice a day. And the whole system, I mean, it seems to me that notwithstanding the contracts being handed back, the beneficiaries of this is the taxi operators, not the children. So that's the challenge, and elsewhere in the report, going to talk later about ways we can increase provision, in-county provision, which I know we've been talking about for years, trying to do. But you just think, well, wouldn't that money, that 20 million that we're now forcing, we're being forced to spend on delivering our statutory responsibilities, you just wonder if we put that money to borrowing, how many special schools we could build, local provision. We still don't have one in every district. I know we've got good news coming, and then you're talking about others as well. But in the south of the county, where I think we move a lot of children from parents, from feedback that they receive and other members receive, I don't think we have a special school in Harborough. I know we're not looking on district boundaries, but in that part of the county. So the challenge going ahead, I think, is how we could we not reinvest some of the money to actually borrow money? Do other authorities just rely, I think this is my key question, do other authorities just rely on waiting for the government to fund special schools, or do they actually look in-house to see, well, if we looked at a long-term position of actually borrowing to invest, to make increased provision on the ground, then we could get our transport costs down. I think that's my first key issue. I did want to pick up on where we've clearly got problems in the assessment. Paragraph 33 talks about our statutory deadlines. We're not able to meet those. I wonder what the consequences of that are. We're not on that. Okay, I'll wait till we get to that then.
Thank you, Chair. Do you want to come back on that, Anne?
Just a couple of observations, if I could. I mean, absolutely, I would agree in terms of, nobody wants to have children in transport for significant, amounts of time and mileage, etc. If you can avoid that, it will always be a balance between the provision you can make and therefore you'll have to transport. You will always have to transport at some point, won't you? And ultimately, even if you had a special school in every every district, chances are you will not cater for every child's need in that district, and you will still have to do some. And it's a wider question. Yes, one, from the funding coming from the government in terms of special school places, what the authority's position and financial appetite for risk and borrowing as to whether it wants to put more into local provision, etc. And that offset between the cost and transport. You know, I think we all know 20 million is a lot of money. However, provision of special schools across every district is a lot of money, and it's going to be that wider financial balance. So, I mean, I think absolutely would agree with the principle. However, it's got to be an individual authority decision in terms of that appetite for risk on borrowing. And equally, what's forthcoming from the government. But I think none of us are particularly hopeful on that.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, the County Council has put in significant capital funding, and actually the grant funding from DFE is relatively minimal compared to the amount of capital that we have spent. And you'll see in the report, over the past 5 years, we've invested around about 30 million in order to build provision. I think the point Anne made is really important. We don't want children to be transported long distances, but there are many reasons why children are transported. So some children are transported very locally to their school because they have no means of getting there. Some children are travelling a long distance, and sometimes that's because that's the parental choice. That's where the school is that can best meet needs. Sometimes it is about sufficiency, and sometimes it is about the fact that we don't have more local schools. So part of our capital programme that we've got in place at the moment for SEND is about making sure that we have the right provision to meet the needs of children, and that as far as possible that provision is local, because we know that's what's best for children anyway, to be educated within their local communities. But there will be times, and there will continue to be times, where children do need transporting to the provision that meets their needs, but equally to a provision that may well just be down the road because there's no other way of getting that child there.
Did you want to say something, Chris?
Yeah, Jane made the point I was going to make about the 30 million, and I suppose that the other issue I'd make with the 30 million is that was out of County Council resources. That wasn't DFE resources. So there's two elements to kind of fixing this. One is around kind of capacity and the capacity of kind of special schools places, and the other one's around demand management. So it's both, but we have put significant resources in the past to actually increase the number of places.
Rosita, did you?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I've got to echo the point that this is a really comprehensive report, and thanks to everybody who was involved. Now, Jane, in the beginning, you were talking about the criteria and the formulae space, and I wonder, for me to get my head around, whether you could elaborate a little bit on the criteria on which the funding is based, and, you know, whether we have got any influence towards having that probably increased or whatever. You also mentioned several times the deficit we have occurred. Now, how does that deficit sit within the budget? Is there any chance that we are ever recuperated and get back on an even keel, or do you see that increasing? And if so, how are we going to cope with it? And again, thank you to everybody for this report. It's brilliant.
Yeah, if it's okay, I'll hand that question over to my colleague Jenny, who has more detail about the funding formulas. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, the formula was established back in, I think it was 2019-20, and the DFE have continually said that they will review that formula, but have failed to do so. It's quite complex. Some of the formula is based on historic spend, but it picks up information on prior attainment of children. It picks up on the number of special school places that we fund, as opposed to EHCPs. But the biggest and there's an element in there that looks at pupil population. So it looks at the overall population in the county. What we see from the benchmarking information that's nationally available is Leicestershire is a low need authority in terms of the funding it triggers through the additional factors within the formula, but our demand is quite high. We are expecting some review of the formula as a result of the green paper, and whenever that feeds through. But at the minute, there is no intention for the DFE to alter what is a nationally driven formula.
Chairman, if I may come back. So the salient point is that we are lowly funded but high need. So is there anything that we can do as an authority? And I know there's a consultation going, but what we can do as an authority to get that point over?
Shall I have a go at this one? It's an interesting one actually, because everybody knows we're the lowest funded county council in the country, but actually on SEN I think we're about mid-table, aren't we? Although we're kind of low need. It's one of the funding streams where we're not the lowest in the country, but clearly the amount of money we're getting from government doesn't meet the demand we're facing by significant kind of amounts. To just kind of picking up the issue around the deficit. Is that table on page 16 that Jane went through? You can kind of see the cumulative deficit. I think the end of next year is 53, rising to 91 million, and that's after the TESOL savings are factored in. So despite the fact we're going to make significant savings through what is going to be a pretty challenging transformation programme, the deficit is still increasing. And I think we've had discussions with government kind of in the run-up to this, and I think we're going to have some more discussions as part of the DBVS programme about how we actually bring this back into line, because the partner we're working with, Newton Europe, and I know Jane will get onto this later on, are kind of nationally leading in terms of that programme. So if working with them we can't bring our own local budget back into position, clearly we're going to have to work with the DFE about what else we can do to actually bring that budget back into line. My personal view is there's two sides to this. There's locally what we can do, but there's also there needs to be some reform to the national system, and that's the bit we're lacking at the moment. But I dare say we'll get into that in a later second half of this session.
Okay. I think Jane, did you want to come back, Jane, or not?
Yeah, sorry, it was just, I think Chris made the point I was going to make. It was just the point around demand. I think that is really significant for us in Leicestershire, that whilst need may be identified as low, the demand that we're facing within Leicestershire is really high. And I'll come on to that a bit later on in the paper around what we're doing and what we're looking at to resolve that.
Okay, James.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question on taxis and the contracts being handed back. To what extent does the contract allow for inflationary changes? And I guess, does it, first of all? And if not, and if it does, then why are they being handed back? Are there other things other than that? And if not, do you think that's potentially something that could be looked at?
Thank you. Yeah, we do have standard, clauses for inflation, but I think what we've seen in the last couple of years is that's far outweighed, the inflation that the sector has seen far outweighed what those contracts cover. What we did do then, acknowledging the difficult market we've got, is we allowed contracts to be renegotiated up to 15%. And that was the standard. We'd have that negotiation. If the operator still wouldn't operate them for up to 15%, we then put them out to the market again. So we did, we took steps over and above our normal position in terms of the inflationary aspect of the, the allowances within the contract.
Linda.
Thank you. I'm really, this report is really helpful in order for us to sort of analyse where we're going with both of these. The one thing that I don't know whether or not we could have just a bit of an update. In the report, it says this is unsustainable and remains the most significant financial risk of the county. Whether we just unpick that a little bit. I suppose the funding though is there's a review, but there's been failed to do so. The national picture is that the deficits are 3.6 billion. So Leicestershire's position is an amount within a much larger pot. So what work has been done with the department to lobby for that, because we're not the only authority that is struggling with its SEND budget. How are we dealing with that? How are we working with other authorities to actually lobby for additional support in SEND? Because clearly there's not enough money in the budget. That's the issue. In terms of the transport, have we seen any real difference in the distance that is travelled to school? And what work are we, I mean, you know, Simon talked about a school in every district. I don't know whether that, you know, strategically though, is what do we do to reduce the amount of distance from the where person lives to where the children go to school, and how are we managing that? Do we know where those, you know, the special school places of the future need to go? What's the strategic position? Because we can't continue to allow the transport budget to grow and grow and grow. There are other ways to reduce it, which is reducing distance. So what work are we doing in order to strategically place new provision closer to where people live? And that'd be really useful. Thank you.
Shall I pick up the first question, the last question first, and then hand over to Anne, and then Chris for the first one? Is that okay? Just in terms of sufficiency, we've as we've set out in the report, we've had a plan over the last 5 years that has built a range of provision in order to meet children's needs, and that the strategic focus of that was about where are the needs, and what are the needs, and therefore what do we need to build. So through that programme, we built a number of special schools. So there were specific schools for children with communication and interaction difficulties, and a specific school for children with social, emotional and mental health challenges. And they were very deliberately placed in areas where we'd identified the need. And on top of that, we built a number of what we call units attached to mainstream schools. And again, they were built according to the needs that we'd identified. So primarily, we identified a gap in provision for children with communication interaction difficulties or autism and other issues on the spectrum. And therefore built a strategy around that with the expressed desire of meeting need and educating children locally. What we found through that was that provision filled very, very quickly through demand. So we're now refreshing our strategy about what we essentially need to build in order to meet need. It is challenging because although it would be ideal to have a special school in every area, what we then might find is that we can't fill that special school because there isn't the need. So it takes some really careful planning in terms of understanding need, but also understanding where those children live and where those children are going to live as well. So part of our strategy going forward is another 2 special schools. So we've got another, again, you've read in the paper, we've got a special school planned in the north of the county for children with communication interaction difficulties, and another school in the north of the county for children with SCMH. And part of the strategy is not just building places, but making sure that we've got the right children in the right provision. And again, we'll come on to a bit more detail in that around the Transforming SEND and Inclusion programme, because what we found previously is when we built, we filled very quickly. And some of that is because we haven't necessarily had the right children in the right provision. So we've got the money from the DFE in order to build those 2 special schools, and you'll again see in the paper that we still have a pot of capital left, which through the Transforming SEND and Inclusion programme, we're working out exactly what need we have and where we need to build provision.
Just to add to that, from my perspective, you know, there's 3 factors that influence how far we transport children. One is the provision, the location of provision, which Jane's just covered for you. The second one then, you know, when it comes into the department, we're required to put on transport is the HCP, and that then dictates which setting that goes to. But then back, I understand within the children's department, in going through that process of putting the EHCP in place, there is a conversation and a requirement and a consideration around transport and therefore setting. Now, obviously, you know, there's parental preference, etc., which will impact on that. But ultimately, then there is a discussion, a consideration about transport as part of that wider EHCP. However, when it comes into my department, it's fixed. There is a destination written there that we are duty bound to provide transport to. What we can then do is look at the best way to do that. Things like route optimization. Is it solo transport, or can you put it in multiple transport? And therefore, how do we optimize that route to minimize the transport? Thinking about all the requirements, length of time a child is on board a vehicle if you're having to pick up, taking all these considerations. But that's the only other element we've got to influence and try and reduce that travel time, mileage, etc.
Just to add to that, I suppose we mustn't lose sight of the fact that we can't build ourselves out of this demand. It's not a way to go forward, is just to continually to build special schools. What we need to focus on is keeping the majority of children in mainstream school and being included in their local community and supported in mainstream schools for their needs. So I think we mustn't lose sight of the fact that that's the focus of what the work that we're doing, that we'll come further on to, is inclusion in schools, and we're working really close with schools to make that happen. So, you know, we can't continue to build special schools. What we need is special schools that meet the needs of those children, the complexities of some of the children that we've got within the county. But we can't continually just build, because we'll end up with special schools that are, like Jane said, that are half filled and we can't staff, which would be even worse situation to be. So for me, my focus is ensuring that we can meet all the needs of children, but the majority of children need to be in mainstream school and supported to stay there.
Okay. Yes, Chris.
I pick up the finance element of the question. If I start with the lobbying one, I mean, I think the figure you quoted, 3.6 billion, I think that came out of a survey that was completed by Treasurers Society, so the London Treasurers Society, County Treasurers. And there's been an awful lot of work done by treasurers in terms of lobbying both DLUC and the DFE around this issue, because clearly it has a major impact in terms of financial sustainability. The county council network have also been very kind of active in this area as well. I possibly think the LGA could do a bit more, to be quite honest. They've done some, but I don't think they've really pushed it. So I think there's more that can be done at a national level around this. And at a local level, I know probably a couple of years ago we met the minister, didn't we? And we do lobby and we do push. But the DFE haven't really quite come forward with the right solution yet, in my view, anyway. But in terms of it being a massive financial issue, you're right, it is a massive financial issue. I quoted that figure, kind of 53 million deficit kind of next year, rising to 91 million kind of in 4 years after that. In terms of, we're in the what's called a Delivering Better Value in SEND programme. What happens is if you reach a certain threshold, you go into what's called the safety valve programme, and at that point you have a negotiation with the DFE around kind of how you're going to pay off that historic deficit. And generally the way it works is they'll demand some payoff from the county council resources, the DFE might put some money in as well, and there might be some kind of transfer from the schools block. So if the deficit continues to rise to the level we think it's going to rise to, we'll end up in that safety valve programme with what would be quite a difficult negotiation with DFE officials about how we're going to fund it. There's about 5 authorities were the initial tranche within the safety valve. I think there's about 12 or 13 in there currently. I'm getting mixed reports about how that programme's going as well. So we'll have to kind of see how that kind of pans out nationally.
Mr. Richardson.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of very quick ones for clarification. The chart at the top of page 18, where we talk about the SEND transport costs, is that just for taxis, or does that include our own transport costs in that? And second question, if I do them both at the same time, is Jane, you mentioned parental choice. To what extent does parental choice override where we might want to offer a place, and what has been the impact, or what do we believe the impact of parental choice has been on perhaps the distance that children are being, or the distance children are travelling because of their parents' requirements, rather than where the space that might be, in our view, acceptable for that child is, if that makes sense.
I'll start with the first one, if that's all right. Just to confirm, it is both. It's in-house fleet costs and taxi costs, so it's in totality.
So just in terms of parental choice, the Code of Practice puts a very significant weighting on parental choice, and the local authority has got to pay attention to it in detail. So often parental choice will override the proposal of the local authority, unless the local authority can demonstrate that it's a much more kind of best interests of finances option and can meet need. But you'll note from the report that I've set out that we do enter into a number of tribunals, because often we don't agree, or the parent doesn't agree with the provision that we're suggesting for their child, and tribunal, where that does happen, it goes to tribunal, and more often than not the tribunal will then rule in favour of the parent. So often parental choice will have the greatest sway in where their child goes. In terms of the influence on distance, I think it's mixed. So I think there are times when the parental choice is for a school that happens to be a long way away, and therefore, you know, either the tribunal will rule in favour or indeed it is the provision that can best meet needs. And again, as much as often the reason the child is travelling is because it is the only provision that can meet child's needs. So I think it's a mixture in terms of the whether it's the parental choice that leads to further distances or the fact that it's the best school to meet need.
Okay, Mr. Bill.
Yes, you and I attended the school's allocations meeting yesterday for North West Leicestershire and Hinckley and Bosworth. And I mean, that situation is complicated in itself, but one of the issues which was raised was the coming together of the Dorothy Goodman School, which is a SEND school, obviously, with some of the mainstream, one of the mainstream schools, which Deborah was referring to. So there's going to be there's going to be more of the SEND children coming into the to mainstream schools, and this was raised in connection with the new Hollycroft Primary School. Now, if we're starting to integrate to what extent can be, you can integrate these SEND youngsters into the mainstream schools, is this going to be, is this part of the answer to reducing transport costs? Well, that's very encouraging for a start. So that's useful, but obviously it is so complex because on the western side of Hinckley we have 6 primary schools or secondary schools or special schools, and we've got enormous congestion, as Anne knows. We were always talking about this. So we're probably, hopefully we're going to solve one problem, which is the educational challenge, but we're probably going to increase the transport congestion problem at the same time. I think that is the way to. I think that policy of reducing transport costs by which is a spin-off benefit, isn't it, from bringing SEND youngsters into mainstream schools and vice versa. I think that is of great benefit, but it does raise all kinds of other questions at the same time. It's a complex issue, and I do appreciate being invited here just to engage in this issue. Yeah.
Thank you, David. Jane, do you want to?
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the, as Mrs. Taylor set out, the kind of central point that we're looking at through some of the transformation work is how we can enable children to remain in mainstream. Those children with special educational needs can remain in mainstream and still have their needs met. So I think any work that's going on between special schools and mainstream schools is absolutely to be welcomed. And indeed, we've seen some really good pieces of work across the county where special schools are either supporting children within mainstream school, within units attached to mainstream school, or indeed have satellites within mainstream school, so that those children can experience education alongside their peers, but also within their local authority. And I know certainly Dorothy Goodman is one of the academies that's done a lot of work across the Hinckley area, and in order to support inclusion in mainstream schools as well as meet needs. And as you say, any kind of change in use or change in profile of children at a school may well have impact on some of the transport needs or the traffic going in. I think what's important to note is that there won't be an additionality of children as a result of this strategy. There may well be a slight difference in terms of how those children are transported, but we'd still be looking at the same number of children attending the provisions, and therefore we would have paid attention to that in developing the provision. But yeah, it's absolutely a strategy we would support around how special schools are supporting children to be educated locally.
Do any other members want to make any comments at this stage? No, I would just say on page 18, obviously the key thing there seems to be the number of pupils goes up from 1,750 in 2018, 2019 to nearly double to nearly 3,500 in 26-27. And I know Anne mentioned that the annual cost per student is going down or estimated to go down from 8,000 this year to about 7,500 in 26-27. So in terms of trying to bring down costs, there is efforts being made there. But the simple problem is the increase in demand, and obviously you're going to end up with a huge deficit here, and most other places are facing huge deficits as well. So really it does seem to be a national solution to be found to how authorities get properly funded to deal with the huge increase in demand that they're facing and are going to face in the near future. Did we want to move on to the next section?
Yes, if I can, Chair, move on to the next section, which is entitled Centre Services in Leicestershire, and just give a bit of an overview around the demand across Leicestershire in relation to education, health and care plans, but also some of the work that we're doing to seek to reduce that and make sure children's needs can be met. So as we've set out and as we've discussed, the demand in our local SEND system does continue to have a significant impact on the position financially, but also the position of the local authority to deliver the assessments within statutory deadlines. So we've seen a 54% increase between 2016 and 2020 in the number of children who are requiring an education, health and care plan. And you can see that is an increase which is larger than that was experienced nationally and regionally as well. And at the same time, the funding hasn't increased to support that local trend. And we've seen a continuation of that trend between 21 and 22 with a further 38% growth in numbers. The increase in demand, so the increase in the number of requests for assessment is leading to both drift and delay within the Special Educational Needs Assessment Service, which sits within the Children and Family Service. And that means that the statutory deadlines that we're set nationally within the SEND Code of Practice are not being met. So we're currently required to undertake an assessment within 20 weeks. And at the moment, the local authority is doing them within about 36 weeks. So we're well outside the statutory deadline. The impact of that is that children's needs are not being assessed within a timely manner, and it's leading to a number of complaints from parents and carers and schools. And we are seeing an increasing number of appeals against decisions made by the local authority. And as I said earlier, a growing number of cases that are going to tribunal, which most often leads to the decision ruling against the local authority and in favour of the parent and carer. There are a number of historical and demand-related reasons for the increase in the number of education, health and care plans, some of which are national, some of which are being experienced more locally within Leicestershire. So the SEND reform back in 2014 led to a number of changes within the SEND system. And as members will know, the Green Paper has been published by government, which sets out a range of options to think about how we might change the system for children. It doesn't deal with some of the things that were set out in the SEND reform, which we're dealing with currently. One of them was the widening of the age responsibility. So the age responsibility would move from 18 to 25 with no funding associated with that. There was a significant rise in the expectations across the system and predominantly on local authorities around what we have to do. Locally, specifically for Leicestershire, some of the ongoing budget pressures in school does mean that their capacity to effectively support children in mainstream, as we've talked about, was significantly reduced because the funding wasn't there to support the schools. I know I've touched on this already, but the new capacity that we put in for special educational needs just didn't keep pace with the rise in demand. And so we have continued to rely on independent providers, which are much more costly than those that we deliver locally or that are delivered through our academies. And we've seen, as a result of that, an increase in the unit cost, so the cost per pupil of places within the system. And the cost of cases going to tribunal, or the amount of cases going to tribunal, is also having an impact on the numbers of children within the system. So in recognition of those demand-related issues and the fact that we're projecting such a significant deficit, we launched the Transforming SEND and Inclusion programme in Leicestershire that has looked at areas that we need to prioritise in order to get not just the service working in the most effective way, but also how we might look across the system. So look at our schools, look at our parents and carers and others, to think about how we might work with children differently, and how we might be able to support more children to be successful within mainstream settings as well. And really around how we can resolve some of those short-term pressures we're seeing within the service around demand. In terms of self-sufficiency, the Education Act set out a statutory duty on local authorities to secure sufficient school places, not just for mainstream school, but for those children who require specialist provision. And it is really clear about the fact that the local authority needs to do that for special education, but also for alternative provision as well. Between 2017 and 21, we created an additional 551 places. We've done that through the creation of special schools, through units attached to mainstream schools, but we've also grown our special schools as well. So we've put additional places in some of our special schools as well. But there still remains a pressure. So we've still got 387 children who are in independent provision. And that is the provision that I talked about earlier that does cost significantly higher amounts per pupil. But as we've talked about, there still remains a significant pressure on our area special schools, but also a demand for places or those children who do require special provision and our ability to find an appropriate placement for them. In between 22 and 24, the DFE allocated as a capital grant of 16.5 million, which was specifically dedicated to support the development of SEND places in mainstream schools. The 5.2 million of this grant has already been allocated towards creating 166 additional places. So we've got an unallocated balance at the moment of 11.3 million. It would cost us just about that to build a new area special school. So we're working carefully at the moment around exactly what we do need, as I explained earlier in the answer to one of the questions. We've been really fortunate that we've been successful in our bids for free school programmes. So just earlier this month, there was a DFE announcement around the capital bid that we were successful for around the school in Quorn. And prior to that, the DFE announced that we were successful for a 60-place school within Shepshed area as well. And on top of that, we've got about 130 additional places that are in train being built ready for September 2024 at various points. And further expansion of the capital programme is being informed through what we know about need, demand, location, and what's already in the system through the TISL programme. So do you want me to pause there, Chair, or do you want me to talk a bit more about the TISL programme? Okay, thank you.
We'll pause there. Thanks, Jane. I think Rosita, were you first, and then Mr. Barr.
Thank you. Councillor Taylor said we can't build ourselves out of this situation, and you just said it would cost us 11.3 million just about to build another school. Now, it was just going through my head, and I thought to myself, but how would that create a fair geographical spread? Because in order to go back to saving on the transport cost, we need a fair geographical spread and catchment areas. So how do you dovetail this to ensure that? Because if you're building, if you're looking at place, then you need to take into consideration that journey and the provision of. And on the back of that, we have got clear identified need with having established that there are 387 places needed, rising, etc., etc. So that surely gives us the power to influence Section 106 agreements and working with planning policy to ensure that all other local authorities within Leicestershire put this and work this through their local plans, because as we know, if a need is identified, then this can be picked up in local plans. And my last question is because you said that we are having quite a lot of people challenging us, therefore their tribunals, and it is very costly. Is that cost something that is so substantial that, you know, we are sometimes making allowances? You know, just talk me around that a little bit more. Thank you.
So if I take the first question around building schools, you're right. So the 11 million unallocated capital funding could be used to build an additional area special school. so a kind of a single school. I think we'd need to be really clear about what the needs were, where we would benefit, and remind ourselves that area special schools are predominantly more kind of generic special schools, so they don't I mean, they're all of the, we're very fortunate in Leicestershire, we have outstanding and good special schools, but they are they're very specific around needs. Part of the strategy over the last 5 years has been to build much more locally, and we've built more units attached to mainstream schools than we have kind of bigger special schools. And where we've built bigger special schools, they've been around often single needs, so SEMH, or social emotional mental health difficulties, but also those children with autism or other issues. So part of the work that we need to do is have a think about what the needs are, but also where the localities are that we could meet need as well, and think about how best we can use that 11 million in order to meet the needs as well. In terms of 106 agreements, absolutely right. Again, we need to remember that the kind of level of need across a locality is relatively low. So it may not attract a big amount of Section 106 money in order to meet SEND. What we are doing more recently with some of the new negotiations that we're making is looking at where we do build mainstream schools, we get the developer to think about what they could do to support SEND as part of that. So either to build a unit attached to it, or to really think creatively about how we could use 106 funding to bolster some of the things that we're doing across mainstream schools. In terms of the tribunal outcome, this is it's really complex. So what's happening in tribunal is that parents are going when they don't agree with the decision that we've made around either whether we assess a child in the first place or the provision that we've identified for them. When we go to tribunal, we're very clear. We think we've done the assessment right, and we think we've got the needs right for that child. And what invariably happens is that when it gets to tribunal, the tribunal overrule and rule in favour of the parent, and that does cost us money, because it'll cost us to do an assessment, or it'll cost us to place that child within the provision that they're doing. So we do look carefully at the cases that we go to tribunal on, and obviously where we do go to tribunal, it's where we're confident that we're making the right decision for the child in terms of needs. But the outcome of tribunal is costing us significant money.
Can I just come back? It's cost also awarded towards us, and it's all of that featured in the budget.
The cost is an expenditure to us, so the outcome of the tribunal will be either increased placement cost or the cost of us delivering an ISP. So the tribunal doesn't award a cost, the tribunal awards an outcome. So the tribunal will tell us, no, you've got to do an assessment, or you've got to place a child in that provision, and that then invariably costs us money.
Okay. Mr. Barclay.
Thank you. I acknowledge the work that's been done really in quite difficult circumstances. I mean, the number of people who require special education needs has gone up by 25%, and the education, health and care within the last 4 or 5 years has gone up by 54%, which is disproportional to national and regional averages. A very simple question: what are we doing different to other counties, and why? I know it's not one you can answer, but that seems to be a fundamental problem with the rate of growth in needs in care plans and SEN. It's difficult to see how we can ever resolve it, quite frankly, without substantially more government funding, and that doesn't look as though it's forthcoming, because despite the increase, there has been no increase in funding. But within reason, you appear to be doing everything you possibly can to meet the needs of the children, which but I just wonder, what are we doing different to other authorities, other local authorities, and what, the easy question to ask, but not necessary to answer, why are we so widely out of sync with other authorities? I appreciate it's not your fault, but we must be doing something different.
Yeah, I mean, it's complex and a kind of very mixed answer. And one of the reasons is what we know is that our growth started slightly later than other authorities. So the SEND reforms were introduced within 2014, and we were, I think, probably slower in some of the developments, and therefore our growth started in kind of 2016, whereas others started a bit earlier. I think school funding is an issue. I think what we have seen historically in Leicestershire, I mean, school funding is much more levelled now, but what we saw in Leicestershire is the need for specialists being identified because schools just did not have the resource to support children within mainstream settings. I think the will's there for schools. I think they do want to be inclusive, but often they're making a choice between having an in-class learning support assistant or using that money to support a child with SEND because there isn't the funding. So I think funding is a significant issue that has impacted, therefore, on the amount of demand that's come into the local authority. I think we've identified through the Transforming SEND and Inclusion Programme in Leicestershire, there is more that we can be doing within the department around how we manage some of the processes for education, health and care plans, how we think about doing things a bit differently in terms of promoting inclusion in schools, and how we might be a bit more creative about what we can do to support children in mainstream. So I think there are a whole myriad of reasons, many of which are historical, that resulting in this level of increase at the moment. But the programme that we've got is kind of trying to really get underneath and have a look at how we can stem some of the demand, but still make sure that we're meeting children's needs as best we possibly can, as we've said previously, within mainstream where they can be met.
Thank you.
Mr. Poland.
Thank you, Chair. Just talking about the state schools and not the private schools that we send to, but the state ones. Do we look at that at all on a regional level? So what my thinking is there, obviously you're talking about capacity within Leicestershire, but could it be the case, for instance, that there's maybe capacity in Southern Derbyshire or Nottinghamshire or Northamptonshire or whatever, and likewise, they might have different specialisms that we have and vice versa. So we talked before in terms of distance to travel, but distance to travel doesn't necessarily equate to within Leicestershire. So, for instance, a student in Loughborough would be much nearer to Long Eaton than they would be to Wigston, for instance. So, to what extent does that sort of conversation go on? And the kind of link to that, following on from that, we're talking about building new schools. Now, I appreciate that we've also talked about sort of expanding mainstream schools to have SEND provision, but if we were looking at building wholly new schools, do we have conversations again with neighbouring authorities in terms of sharing costs, sharing need and so forth, and building them somewhere that's maybe closer to the border with those authorities, so that again both sides can share the cost and share the provision?
Yeah, in terms of the kind of non-private schools or non-independent schools and capacity in other areas, I think it's fair to say that our colleagues across the region have the same challenges as us. So we would be very quick to have conversation of whether they've got capacity within their schools. But what I know is that they're struggling as much as we are. However, just jumping to your last point about or one of your points about travel to other authorities, we do have children who attend special schools within the city, within Derbyshire, because that's a school that's been identified that can meet need. And as you'll know, with any issue around admissions, schools and local authorities can't make a decision based on where a child lives. So children can go to special schools in other areas, and indeed they do. So we have children from other local authorities within our special schools, and we have some of our children in schools across the borders as well. One of the key issues for Leicestershire is that we do have a higher proportion of independent schools in Leicestershire. That's a historic issue where it was encouraged as a strategy to allow some of the development of local providers, which has led to Leicestershire having a much higher proportion of independent schools. Now, many local authorities use those places, so they have children that travel into Leicestershire or children that travel out of the city to use some of those independent places. But we do have more independent schools than most other local authorities, I think, in the country, not just within the region. And hence we are trying to build more provision so that we can have some really good quality provision locally in Leicestershire that doesn't cost as much. And again, around building new schools, we do work with neighbouring authorities, but part of the work that's going on at the moment is that all local authorities are looking at their sufficiency. So there are no local authorities, I think, with the kind of spare capacity to be thinking creatively about how we do things. And actually, at the moment, we've got enough need within Leicestershire to build our own schools without kind of needing, I guess, to partner with other local authorities, not just to share the costs, but to kind of keep the places ready for Leicestershire children as well.
Simon.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So with all the problems we've got, it seems to me the immediate thing that we need to address and do something about is the assessment. And it all kind of hinges on Senna, I think, and what we can do to improve and help them there, both in terms of capacity. I mean, you mentioned, Jane, that it's a lot to do with the numbers going up, but I mean, have we got a lot of vacancies there? Are we lacking capacity to deliver the service? Are we struggling to recruit people? Is there anything we could do? Because it really is not working at the moment. It's difficult to say that it's actually not failing in terms of some of the feedback that we get as members. So we've got the statutory process, and I asked earlier, you know, what's the consequence of not meeting those times? Presumably we have to do a return to DFE. If we're not consistently meeting the statutory timescales, and that's as I understand it for the initial issuing of the plan. But then there's the annual review process. So what's the situation with the annual review process? And then when we do go to tribunal, what sometimes seems to happen is right just before the tribunal. I asked a question about this at the last council meeting. Just before the tribunal sits, we say, OK, we'll accept what the parent wants to avoid. And I wonder why we wait to the very last few days, because that infuriates parents, because then they'll say, well, why didn't you just do that at the beginning and avoid the whole process? There must be a reason why we do that, but I'm not really understanding that at the moment. So, yeah, it seems to me that in the short term, we've got to address the pressures and issues in Senna, and that will help to address parent frustration and complaints that we get. The other final comment I'd make is that too often the plans are issued with some really basic mistakes, like it has the wrong information in it, names the wrong school even. That also infuriates parents. Is there not just a checking process that we could do to make sure before they go out that they are actually checked for accuracy? Thank you.
Yes, if I pick up the matter around assessments first. So Senna is one part of the assessment process. So there's a service within the department called the Special Educational Needs Assessment Service, who are responsible for kind of pulling together all of the information that's part of an education, health and care plan. One of the reasons, or the most significant reason for the backlog, is the availability of educational psychologists. So the issue doesn't sit within the Senna service, it's around the availability of educational psychologists. So this is, again, it's a national issue. The SEND Code of Practice says that educational psychologists have got to provide advice to an education, health and care plan. The availability or the ability to secure educational psychologists is an issue nationally. So what we know is that the main reason for the delay in assessments is the fact that there is a significant delay within getting educational psychology advice. So we do employ a number of educational psychologists, but we've been holding now for probably well over a year a number of vacancies and are unable to get the amount of educational psychologists that we require, not just to meet the demand, but just to undertake the assessments that are required. So it should take about 6 weeks, but it's taking about 20 weeks at the moment for EP advice. That's then causing a significant delay when it gets into the Senna service to pull together the advice from our health colleagues, social care colleagues and our educational psychologists. So the Senna service is then responsible for pulling some of that together. In order to address the EP issue, we've just recently, just before Christmas, invested in looking at how we can secure some increased EP capacity in order to move some of that backlog through, in order to get the assessments moving. On top of that, we have had significant capacity challenges within the SEN service. Some of that is about the increased demand that's coming in. Some of it has been around holding vacancies and our ability to fill those vacancies, and some of it has been as a result of some of the impact of stress and well-being on the service, which has led to long-term sickness. So we do have a capacity issue within that service. Those staff are working as hard as they possibly can in order to not just get the assessments through, but to undertake the annual reviews as well, which I'll come on to. We know that the quality of education, health and care plans is not where we need it to be. And indeed, Ofsted came back in before Christmas to undertake our re-inspection on 2 areas. And one area they found that we still hadn't made sufficient progress, which is around the quality of the HCPs. The primary reason for that, or as not meeting that expectation, was around timeliness. They did see an increase in the quality and improvement in the quality of the HCPs, but we weren't able to meet that requirement because our timeliness is well out of kilter from where it should be. So we know that as a result of the capacity and as a result of the pressure within that service, some of the plans that are being issued are not as we would want them to be, and the quality isn't as what we would want it to be. As part of the Transforming SEND and Inclusion programme, we do have an improvement plan in place for that service, and that involves both increasing the capacity within that service so they have the time, because some of it is just basic time in order to sit and work that through, and because of the pressures of numbers coming through, they don't have the basic time to do the detail. So we have increased some capacity within that service, but we're also looking at some of the processes and way in which we do that. So we have got an improvement plan for that service. In terms of the consequences of the missed timescales, it is significant. It's significant for children because we're taking a lot longer to assess their needs. So rather than waiting 20 weeks, they're currently waiting 35 weeks. And that often means that those children are therefore either in provision that can't meet their need, or they're in provision where we need to put some additional support in. So there is an impact for children on delay. There's an impact for Ofsted. So, you know, as I said, Ofsted were clear that we hadn't made sufficient progress, and therefore we have what's called an accelerated action plan at the moment that the DfE are monitoring us on in order to improve quality. We're legally not compliant, so the SEND Code of Practice is really clear. We've got to undertake assessments within that period, so we're not legally compliant, and that's leading to both some challenges legally, but also increasing complaints as well. In terms of the annual review process, we are responsible for kind of administering the annual review. The annual reviews can take place within schools. So schools can coordinate the annual review, they can hold the meeting, they can review the plan. But the SENA service is then responsible for kind of updating the plan on the system. And we have a backlog there as well, for exactly the reasons that I've just set out around the backlog in assessments. We have got a separate plan to think about how we resolve that. It involves putting some additional capacity in to kind of process those annual review changes. But the annual review meeting can go ahead and the discussion can happen about needs, but obviously the service is responsible for updating the plan. The issue of tribunal is we are aware of. The answer around why do we wait until the last few days is that we will only move into tribunal if we think we're doing the right thing. So we will be very clear. As I said, we've undertaken the assessment. We are clear about the child's needs. We have found a placement that can best meet the child's needs. We get taken to tribunal if the parent disagrees with us. So often the reason why we might make a change right at the last minute is because we've had another look at it and we know the tribunal will rule in favour. But so the delay isn't deliberate. We don't hold on just in case something else happens. Actually, it's a very careful process of continuing to review. Have we made the right decision? Are there any other schools that can meet need? We don't always make the decision at the last minute and make an offer, but there are times when we have another look at the case and know that the tribunal will rule in favour. So we may as well make the decision more quickly for the child and not make them go to tribunal as well.
Thank you, Jane. Amanda.
Thank you, Chair. Just 2 really quick points. We've got 387 children in the private provision sector. The cost differential, I've read somewhere that local authority provision is about £18,000 a year and private's about 55. Obviously, that's a huge difference. And clearly provision of places is part of that, but what work are we doing with the independent sector around cost and supply, those kind of things? And secondly, it identifies one of the reasons that we're struggling is ongoing budget pressures in schools, therefore reducing schools' capacity to effectively support children in mainstream. But our strategy is to support more children in mainstream. So what will change?
how will we be able to support more children in mainstream if actually the school budgets at the moment aren't enabling that to happen now? I mean, my daughter's now in year 8, but when she was in year 5, her primary school actually didn't continue contracts of 4 TAs. At Christmas went, no, we're letting you go. We haven't got the budget. So the TA provision went overnight. So therefore, that's just the impact of the pressure on the budget. And that's just one primary school in Leicestershire. It'd be really useful to know, if we want to move into mainstream, how are we going to do it and support those schools to do it?
Yeah, so just on the point around the cost differential, you're right, the cost differential is huge between what we deliver through academies and through the local authority or other schools. In terms of work with the independent sector, there's a number of things going on. I mean, primarily it's around negotiating fees, but they're private organisations, so it's very difficult to negotiate the fees. And often those children end up in those provisions because that's parental choice. So those schools are better at marketing, they're better at identifying what they can do to meet need. We don't see that they are better in delivering outcomes for children, and actually we have huge confidence in the schools that we deliver locally. So more often than not, it is parental choice for those children to go to the independent sector, but we are continuing to work with them to have conversations about whether or not they can do it cheaper. The ongoing budget pressures in schools are, yes, continue to be an issue, and I know are a challenge for mainstream schools. Indeed, head teachers are, sharing with that with us regularly. I think what we're doing through the programme is looking at how we can use funding differently. At the moment, there's a really strong reliance on naming the number of hours within education, health and care plans for TA support. And as members will be aware, the ability to get learning support assistance is now becoming a national challenge and indeed being experienced locally. So part of the work that we're doing through the programme is looking at how we can use the funding differently, with a real focus on funding needs as opposed to things. So rather than funding a TA or funding a certain provision, what we're looking at is how we can use the high needs block to fund based on needs within schools, and therefore allowing schools to be much more creative with the funding that they have to support children within mainstream. And there are things that we can do differently about how they use the funding and or how we give them funding. So we're currently working with schools on that at the moment. We've got a number of pilots running within schools to look at how we might do inclusion differently, how we might enable children to be successful within mainstream school. So we are piloting at the moment within 10 schools and looking at how they can, undertake inclusive activities or keep children in mainstream. If those pilots are successful, we'll then start rolling those out across the county. And schools want to work with us on that. So schools are committed to having the right children within mainstream, and if we can get the funding right in terms of supporting those children alongside thinking about the activities or the way in which they do it, I think we can be really successful at doing that. But funding within schools, whilst there is now a national funding formula, so Leicestershire is much more levelled with the rest of the country, it remains a challenge in terms of what there is available within schools.
Anyone else have any other questions, comments on this element of the report? Okay, so hand back to you then, Jane.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll move on to give a bit of detail around the transforming SEND and inclusion, but I know we've discussed some of it. So in August last year, we embarked on a Refresh Change programme for SEND and inclusion, really importantly. As a department, we've been working for many years now on strategies to reduce the expenditure within the high needs block and make sure that we're meeting needs for children. So the new refreshed programme does build on the work that we've done previously, but it takes a much wider whole system approach to look at all of the kind of interlinkaging issues that are going on for children, and how we can improve the system more generally. And some of that focus is around how we can reduce demand, how we can make sure that we've got the right provision for children, and how we're making sure that we meet the children's needs within the budget envelope that we've got from the DfE. We decided to commission a third-party partner in order to support us with the programme, primarily because it is a hugely complex piece of work to do, and we know that as a local authority we just don't have the capacity to do that ourselves. So we went out and commissioned Newton Europe was successful, and we therefore have commissioned Newton Europe to work alongside us in really thinking through what the challenges are, to make sure that whatever we deliver is therefore sustainable and has an impact on the budget as well, with a real focus on improving outcomes for children. So we've detailed in paragraph 42 the current trajectory of delivery or benefits through the Transforming Send and Inclusion programme. And we're expecting that we'll deliver around about £32 million worth of benefits up to 28-29, with 21.5 billion being delivered within the current MTFS period. And you can see on the table in paragraph 42, we set out where we're expecting to achieve those benefits. So some of it is about making sure that we've got the right children within mainstream provision, which is what we've talked about, how we can promote inclusion in schools, how we can make sure that those children whose needs can be met in the mainstream school can be successful there. The second area is making sure that we've got the right level of children within specialist provision. What the diagnostic showed us is that there are a number of children whose needs could have been met in a either lower cost provision or indeed mainstream school, so that you can see that the majority of benefits are going to be about getting children in the right provision at the right time in order for their needs to be met. And again, there are some benefits being associated within the right cost of independent provision. You know, as members have set out, the cost of independent provision are more than double that we can deliver. So there's work going on around how we can reduce our reliance really on independent provision, which is where we'll make the most of our cost savings. And then another area is making sure that we get the right contributions from different parts of the system. So the education, health and care plans are education, health and care plans. They're not just education plans. So we need to make sure that where health provision is identified, we've got the right contributions coming in from the right organisations as well. Really importantly, the programme is working collaboratively with a range of stakeholders. This isn't an issue that the local authority can resolve on their own. It relies heavily on education providers to work with us, but also parents and children and carers across the system as well. As part of the work to identify some of the challenges, there wasn't a diagnostic or a really kind of deep dive undertaken in late 2021, which looked at exactly what the challenges were for Leicestershire and some of the difficulties within the local SEND system. And that informed the planning for the programme going forward and informed what we then went out to tender for a partner to work alongside us. We took a report on that diagnostic to the Children and Families Overview and Scrutiny Committee and continue to report to that committee around the progress of the Transforming Send and Inclusion programme as well. So the programme that we're delivering is structured around 4 key work streams. The first one, which I know we've touched on quite a lot today, is around inclusive practice. So how we can make sure that those children whose needs can be met within mainstream do have their needs met within mainstream. Where there's a big strand of work looking at our decision making, about how we do assessments, how we make decisions around placements for children. And then we've got a big work stream around how we understand our data in order to inform planning in the future, but also around need as well. And then a fourth strand around communication engagement, not just in communicating the work of the programme and engagement within the programme, but how we think about how we better communicate with parents and carers and children around their provision and their needs. So the programme has now moved into the design phase, where we're already kind of testing and trialling some of the new ways of working across the system before we implement more widely. As I said, we have taken a number of reports to Children and Families Overview and Scrutiny, and more recently quite a detailed report to committee on the 7th of March, which sets out in much greater detail the kind of work that we're doing and what we're seeking to achieve through the programme. Just, I guess, importantly, in recognition of the fact that the programme needs to both be addressing the future sustainability of the system, but as well as the demand issues, there's been really concentrated activity around transformation. As we've said previously, this is the biggest transformation programme that we've probably run as a local authority, and it's focusing both internally about what we can do, but also about some of the wider system changes that need to happen. I'll pause there, Chair, for questions before we move on to the transport part.
Thank you, Jane. Do we have any questions on that? Yes, Rizzy.
May I just ask, as you just outlined, and in paragraph 48, that you said the reports have been going to the Children and Families Overview. So is it expected that this is going to be a continual progress, whereas as it happens, it goes to that committee and will be reviewed? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a timetable of papers that are going back to Children and Families Overview and Scrutiny, both that will outline the progress of the programme, but also the financial impact of that as well. On top of that, we'll be taking back to Children and Families Overview and Scrutiny the progress we're making around our accelerated action plan that Ofsted have given, or kind of post Ofsted as well. So those reports will regularly now go back to Children and Families Overview and Scrutiny.
Any other comments, questions? No? Okay, so you wanted to come in now, Anne? Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. If it's all right, I'll just round up with the final bit more detail in transport for the Commission. As you've heard, the challenges we're facing in Leicestershire are certainly not unique to us, and that's the same for the SEN transport aspect. And in the report there, you'll see we refer to a County Council's network report, which looked across a number of county councils, 28, and that report came out last year. That established exactly the same drivers we are seeing in terms of cost. That's the greater numbers we're seeing coming through the system, the increasing complexity of those coming through, lack of suitable local placements, and the inflation and other cost rises. I'll point you to the table at the top of page 24, and I'll start with an apology. There is a typo there. It's not referring to an American news channel. It should say CCN, County Councils Network, just for clarity there, okay? And that shows the comparative data across those 28 councils compared to Leicestershire. There's some quite interesting facts and figures in that. For the period 2016-17 to 2021, while the figure for the County Council's network authorities was a 33% increase in cost, for Leicestershire, we were at 28%. However, we do spend a greater proportion of our overall children's budgets on transport at 15% compared to an average 11% across those 28 councils. We also have a slightly higher percentage of contracted services at 74 as opposed to 72 on average. And again, I mentioned that, with our transformation project that we're looking within transport, one of the aspects we are looking at is that, in-house versus, external provision of transport. So just interested to see there, we're a bit lower than the average. A bit higher than the average in terms of that contracted services. Worth highlighting, we've seen greater growth in numbers in Leicestershire, and Jane touched on earlier the number of factors that could be driving that. We've seen 34% increase over the time period compared to 25%. So there is a real difference there, isn't there? It's not just a percent or two. There is a significant difference we are seeing in Leicestershire, and say Jane touched on a number of reasons why that might be the case. Despite that, we have a lower average cost per pupil at just over 5,400 compared to just over 6,000 across those other authorities. So while there is more we need to do, and we absolutely understand that, because we see the forecast, and you see the forecast of the budgets and the level of growth we expect to come through the system. At the moment, as a bit of a comparator and a benchmark, we're relatively efficient. I will caveat that, do not detract. We have got some major work going on about how we continue to drive efficiencies and manage down that growth that will be coming through. If I move on to safeguarding then, and the table under paragraph 53 shows the different aspects of checks and assurances that are carried out across the process and the different parties involved. So that's from the district authorities as the licensing authorities, obviously for the taxi operators, to parents, and then to ourselves, obviously, as the county council. Licensing authorities are required to ensure enhanced DBS, that's the disclosure and barring service check, is in place before granting a licence to an operator. Therefore, in us as a county council procuring a contract with a licensed taxi operator for SEN transport, the county council expects that to be in place and be monitored by the licensing authority, and that is set within our contracts with the individual taxi operator. For drivers in our own fleet, our own in-house fleet, and for escorts as well, we'll carry out DBS checks for our employees, or require those to be provided if they're provided through a contract, such as a taxi operator. We've also covered, just at the end of the report, some questions that we do get asked fairly frequently. Just thought it might be useful to bring up within this report. One that I get from time and time again is, for those families with mobility cars, are they still eligible for SEN transport? Because you would tend to think, if they have that, no, we shouldn't then be providing that, and as a local authority paying for that. The short answer, however, is yes, they are still eligible. We do not have a mechanism, and between advice from DFT backed up via Ombudsman's decisions, there isn't a basis for us to deny transport if a person is eligible, a child is eligible for that. And it's exactly the same situation for adult social care transport. If somebody is in receipt of disability living allowance, it does not exclude them from county council provided transport. The other thing we get asked a lot is about mechanisms of contact, and in terms of contact from parents, if they have concern or a query, we have a number of mechanisms for them to come, and at points they can contact us. We provide information on how to contact us from the very start of the application process, and that continues right through to the confirmation of this is your transport and this is how it will be, etc. And then that's backed up as ever, as with any query, into either my department or the county council. We have our customer service centre and our contacts through there. So, hopefully parents, carers, anybody with any concern has an ability and knows how to get in touch with us. And just mirroring what Jane said in terms of reports to committee, we update the Highways and Transport Overview and Scrutiny Committee, and the latest report on SEN transport went in January this year. And again, we will continue to report through that committee, particularly on, we call it our assisted transport programme, which is the transformation work that my colleague here, Gareth Blackett, is leading for us in terms of looking at how we deliver on SEN transport going forward, given the challenges we have. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Anne. I think Mr. Poland.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anne. In terms of picking up, this is I guess a slightly more specific question, but it's an issue that's been raised with me in the recent past, and I can see it sort of could lead to a wider issue, and that's picking up from childminders as opposed to picking up from home addresses. So my understanding at the moment is taxis will pick up from the home addresses and obviously take to school, and we will allow picking up from childminders so long as the childminder isn't further away than the home address. But I've had a case just recently actually whereby the parent was a teacher and therefore had to be in school in another part of the county early, so needed the childminder provision. But because the childminder was marginally further away, we weren't able to collect, and there were good reasons for that in terms of collecting other children and so forth. But I'm just wondering, in terms of how our policy is in terms of picking up from childminders, that then allows parents to work earlier. It allows children, and something we do. I have had a few cases of whereby my children needs to be in one school and two schools at the same time. Can't be in two places at once. I'm just really wondering to what extent we could look at our policy in regards to picking up from childminders, where it's reasonable distance away from the home. I'm not talking if you're going to have a childminder at the other end of the county or something, but within the same sort of general geographic area. Is that something we can look at in order to allow parents to get back into the workplace easier, and also, as I say, to reduce the stress at going to school time, where you've got two kids, two different schools, but the same start time? And I appreciate that is quite specific, but I thought it would be a pretty time to raise it.
Might be a specific question. Unfortunately, I will give you a general answer. I mean, I think even in just, your narrative in describing that, you understand the complexity of the situation. When we go out to the market, we will contract for, we have to be able to see where they're picking up and where they're going to. So, what somebody bids for and what we are actually commissioning then and procuring. So there's got a fixed start and end point. If it can be accommodated in its nearer, so less mileage and not a cost, an additional cost to that contract, because we've only agreed a set cost for that contract, that may be able to be accommodated. Again, if it's multiple transport, it can be quite difficult. The ability to then add on, in terms of if it's further away, well, actually, we've not paid for that. That's additional cost for us over our budgets. It can be very difficult. The other challenges are things like security. If things are changing, on a regular basis, there's an element about the assurance around the security of that and the safeguarding elements as well. So it's a very complex situation. We absolutely understand some of the pressures, and yes, the logic, absolutely get that. Well, if you could just pick up from a childminder 3 miles down the road, it means I could be at work or etc. Absolutely understand that. But we have to manage that within costs and within our budgets and with safeguarding in mind, etc. So there's a lot of factors in it. We try and balance that as much as we can, but in the end, it does come back to individual circumstances. So it is a quite specific question, and we'd have to look at those on an individual basis. But we have to set that within those higher level principles.
It's just a really quick question on safeguarding. Obviously, there are different layers of safeguarding and different responsibilities for different authorities in the same process. Does that building in that complexity actually have us any concerns around safeguarding? I mean, I've certainly had connections with parents that have had an issue with the transport service because of safeguarding, and I didn't know whether or not this added layer of complexity does open up that risk. No, you're absolutely right. So there comes a point where actually there's a red line. We certainly wouldn't allow any flexibility, etc. The policy is there for a reason, and that is to make sure that we comply with safeguarding, and we are giving that assurance to parents, carers, etc. Because obviously that's the most important thing about the service. We have clear processes, and we'd always be absolutely, clear with the message in terms of if anybody has any concerns around safeguarding, let us know. And we have clear processes about investigation and action we will take, and then we will, we will liaise with Jane's department, the LAD, there's a whole route of escalation. But any concerns around that need to be raised with us, and we'll go through that. And as I say, that's why in a lot of times we can't be flexible and do certain add-ons or do certain other things, because we have to be assured that we can give that level of safeguarding and meet the requirements the regulations stipulate, and give the assurance to the service users. Just to come back on that, obviously the licensing authority is responsible for the license safeguarding, and that's one element of the service. So in my head, we go out to the marketplace, and the taxi provider goes, yeah, I've got my license and it's lodged with this district authority. What check-in do we do with that district authority that the paperwork is all in order? Is that I'm assuming that's part of the process, and we get that assurance that the district authority has done what we expect. I'm assuming, because obviously the district process isn't necessarily Leicestershire district authority, it could be outside of Leicestershire. So is there consistency in that process, and are we comfortable with that?
You're absolutely right. It doesn't mean it'd be a Leicestershire district licensing authorities. In fact, we do have contracts with, taxi companies out with Leicestershire. Licensing authorities have to comply with the strict regulations that they are under, and that is part of they are responsible for ensuring that the DBS is there, and all the other checks that are required is there, and for monitoring that. We can do random checks, but and we certainly do random checks with our operators when they're out and about. However, the absolute liability lies with the licensing authority. We have a contract with the taxi operator that requires them to have everything in place with the licensing authority, and that is our link into the process.
Morgan.
So can I just come in on that one, Anne? I mean, I think your description of licensing authorities and the checks, etc., is absolutely spot on. The report, however, only refers to districts, and my understanding obviously is that we've got the City Council that obviously is a licensing authority. Wolverhampton City Council obviously has decided to sort of stake its ground as being a sort of universal licensing authority across all over the place. So the report only references districts, but actually I don't think that's accurate, is it? Because actually it's just the licensing authority regardless where they are. And as a result, by the sounds of it, we are going out to the general market regardless of where the licenses have been issued. So maybe the terminology in the report is not quite where it should be.
You're absolutely correct, and apologies for that. It shouldn't say districts. It does refer to whoever the licensing authority is. For Leicestershire, that's districts. If it's a unitary, it's obviously the unitary authority. So you're correct. The correct terminology will be licensing.
So blind to where those licenses are issued. The assumption is that the licensing authority is enough to give the seal of approval on what's being tendered.
That's correct.
Mr. Richards.
Thank you, Chair. It's sort of a bit of a semi-tongue-in-cheek question, really, but with the cost of SEN transport continually to increase and projected to increase further, and having looked at some of the profits made by taxi firms who accommodate this market, is it about time we started investing in taxi firms? Because we could then use our portion of the profits to offset the costs, and we'd be far more in charge. So, you know, if the market is expanding, why don't we get in on it, assist our own residents and their children, and make money out of it at the same time?
I'll perhaps maybe give a tongue-in-cheek response to that one. I mean, I think our equivalent at the moment is we look to our own transport, you know, particularly for our most expensive contracts. Could we take this in-house and, you know, do that, you know, more economically for us? I think the whole question about whether the authority wants to get into investing in taxi companies is not one for me. And I'm not even going to deflect to the Director of Corporate Resources. But, you know, it's a wider question for the authority. You know, I think in terms of my department, we certainly get enough services we're running at the moment, never mind, you know, getting into being taxi operators. However, and one final point, I'm not sure the taxi trade themselves at the moment would recognise the extent of the profits perhaps that you're inferring. However, that's another debate.
Thank you. Now, it's actually related to this. In paragraph 52.b, you said taxi firms are private hire the vehicles who go out to it, but this council supports volunteer transport providers, and we are supporting DRT. Now, would it not be prudent to look at those sort of people to provide some home to school transport, or are they prohibited, as you mentioned, under point 55? So that is very much my question, to get my head around that. But also, as you know, all my members' highways fund went to provide 2 electrical buses. Now, they're really, really popular within my, you know, so could we not look at, when we're going to market and asking these providers to ensure that we give preference to somebody who has electrical vehicles, because then that negates the point we're making in 52C, that diesel has gone up to 1, you know, so also it would be saving the planet and adding to our environmental and
thank you. Yeah, on those 2 points, first one around community transport, demand responsive transport, etc. we operate, it's all to do with the types of licenses they operate under and the regulations and the things they're allowed to do. And then again, I'll come back to the safeguarding issue. So that's a very similar question around some of our DRT services, and when they're, sorry, the other way around, our own in-house fleet for SEN, and having that available as DRT, i.e. an ordinary bus service at the same time for residents. It's to do with the licensing and to do with the safeguarding. Unfortunately, the two just don't meet. So, you know, they're entirely different services under the regulations. In terms of the EVs, very much support that. However, the reality of the market at the moment, the cost of an EV is substantially more than the increased cost of diesel. So we could commission that. We could go out to the market for EVs, but we're going to pay more. However, let's hope we're not too far off the market changing and the cost of EVs coming down. And that's when I think, you know, we will see a significant change in that side of things.
Any other members have any questions, comments? No. Okay. Do officers or cabinet members have anything else they want to add on this item? No. Okay. Well, thank you very. Oh, did you want to come in, Mr. Richardson?
I just wonder if we could just have a 5-minute comfort break rather than us all going in and out periodically over the next 10 minutes.
Yeah. So. The ending of this item, yeah, we'll have a quick 5-minute break. Thank you very much, everyone, for a very detailed report, and for everyone who's answered questions, particularly Jane and Anne, who answered a lot of questions and presented the report as well. So thank you very much. It's obviously a very important issue for the authority across a lot of different areas. So it was good that we had a detailed look through it today. So yeah, we'll take 5 minutes and then be back at 1:45 for the MTFS monitoring. Thank you. Good morning. So now we move on to item 9, the MTFS monitoring report, which starts at page 31. Nick Walsh, the head of finance, I believe you're introducing the report, and we have Chris Tambini and Mr. Brecken as well for this item. So if I hand over to you then, Nick, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just firstly, apologise on behalf of Declan Keegan that he couldn't be here this morning. He couldn't make it into County Hall, so I'm covering for him in that instance. So this report summarises the financial position as at period 10, so up to the end of January. The table in paragraph 8 shows that there's a projected overspend at this stage of 2.5 million. And I believe that the last time we brought a report to Scrutiny Commission at period 6, the position was at 8.5 million projected overspend. So obviously things have improved considerably since then. That table breaks down the figures by department, and obviously there's a lot more information about what the variances are in Appendix B. I'll just pick out some of the key points. So in respect to the dedicated schools grant, there's an overspend projected of 7.1 million. And obviously we've just been talking about SEND. The primary reason for that is that we're projecting a 7.8 million overspend on high needs at the end of the year now, which is £1 million less than we'd actually budgeted for. In terms of children and family service, there's an overspend there forecast of 2.5 million, which is very much around the additional children's social care demand and the costs that arise from that. In terms of adults and communities, a 1.4 million overspend. There's a few swings and roundabouts within that overall figure, but there's a significant additional demand in respect of residential care, nursing care and home care. And it's offset by additional income and smaller underspends across a range of services within the department. Environment and transport underspend there, a forecast of 0.9 million. There are a number of additional pressures there around SEN transport, but also mainstream transport and social care transport. But the overspends there are offset by underspends on waste initiatives, but also staffing and a number of other issues within the department. Chief execs, there's an underspend of 0.2 million. That's a sort of net position over a number of over and underspends for different service areas within there, so I won't go through all of the details of that. Corporate resources, there's a forecasting an overspend of 1 million, and that's primarily as a result of the impact on commercial services of inflation and also residual impacts from the pandemic as well. But that overspend on the commercial is offset by a number of underspends across a range of support services, especially around ICT. So the inflation pressures are shown separately here, and obviously they're very significant in terms of 7.5 million over and above what we actually provided for when we set the budget at the start of the year. Inflation, I mean, it's a well-rehearsed issue that impacts kind of across the wider economy at the moment, and obviously we're no exception to that, and that's the impact. The saving grace, if I can call it that, is that as a result of higher inflation, there's also obviously been a knock-on impact in terms of much higher interest rates as well. Because we've got healthy cash balances, we have been able to generate much higher interest on our balances as a result of that. And that's given us 7.7 million more income than we actually were forecasting. So that's the kind of the key factors which make up that overall 2.5 million. I don't know, Chair, if you want me to stop there on the revenue before we go on to capital and just pick up that. Is that right?
That's any members? Mr. Gold.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It's a useful report to see where we are. I mean, one of the threads running through this are where we've got underspends is staff vacancies in all departments. And yet the budget we put through will see a number of significant staff losses. So I'm just wondering what we are doing. I know you've said in the past that you hope it will be netted off by redeployments to a large extent, but presumably the problem is the skills aren't always the ones we're going to lose, aren't always the ones where we've got the vacancies. But are we looking at some sort of programme, presumably quite a major programme, given the number of vacancies we've got, which is impacting on the spending the budget and delivering the service, some kind of major training so that where at all possible staff can be retrained to help fill some of these vacancies, because we're clearly unable to recruit into them. We see a lot of stuff more on social media now, the council trying to get interest, but it's right. I think it was only the other day, there's a major problem in the country with people having left for all sorts of reasons their employment and not really wanting to come back into employment. So that was the first question, is that we seem to have a common thread running across the underspends, the reason for that being staff vacancies. The other area I wanted to pick up was the detailed description of the spending position was the public bus services, which obviously did take up a significant amount of time at the budget. And the detailed description here is that we are forecasting a net underspend of 302k. Now, in the budget papers, we talked about two elements, one being 1.2 million of the overspend, and then a budget requirement, I think, of about 200,000 or maybe a bit more that we needed to take out. This report suggesting that actually additional funding from DFT, the net budget underspend position is only 302k. So I'm interested in understanding the difference between this, which seems to be suggesting that we've now looked at the money from the DFT and actually that 1.2 million has gone down to 302k. I'm interested in understanding what this is actually describing. But then it says DFT funding is not expected to continue into 23-24. Well, that information is obviously out of date, because literally a few days before the budget, the Secretary of State for Transport announced that the fund was going to continue, admittedly only to June. And I asked the director who was with us this morning and got a response from Lee Quincy confirming, yes, the County Council does expect to receive additional income from the COVID fund to help bus operators. We do expect to, but that it is not expected to really help our position in the long term. It's just, I think he described it, one of the members described it as a sticking plaster. But it does seem to me that this is a changing situation. We now have more funding coming in. I know the the decision of the councils to go ahead with the review of public bus services, but this seems to be suggesting that the net budget underspend is nothing as serious as was first indicated.
If I try and pick up the first one, rather than Nick, whether you can kind of pick up the bus operator one. So in terms of the MTFS that was approved in February. Yeah, in February, you're right, it contained significant savings, though at that time we did think that there wouldn't be the need for a lot of redundancies, to be honest. I don't think that's going to be a major issue. For the issue you're actually saying that we've got kind of, I suppose the bigger issue we've got is actually recruiting the right people for the right jobs right across the board in lots of different services. So I don't think there's going to be a need for a kind of retraining program, because I think the net position in each individual service is going to be kind of manageable. But in terms of the recruitment issue, that is more of an issue. So we are doing a lot. So we've done a lot around things like golden hellos, well, not golden hellos, but kind of market supplements and that kind of thing to kind of attract people. And a lot of stuff in terms of just publicising jobs and the rest of it. But it is a major issue, and to be honest, we're kind of making a little bit of a dent in the issue, but I can't see unless there's some kind of national movement that we're going to sort out our recruitment problems, be that in social care or adult social care, children's social care. So I think that is going to be a major issue, but I don't think there's going to be an issue around the need for staff retraining to actually get people into different jobs, because the net position isn't going to be a problem.
I can ask, what is what we think the problem is then? Is it this issue of people retiring early that just decided to leave the service, where they could? There's no other than a personal reason they could continue working.
I think it's multifaceted. So there are kind of people who are retiring, kind of leaving the service. There's an issue around public sector pay falling behind private sector pay and operating within that market. There's people in kind of pretty pressurised jobs across the public sector that have just kind of had enough. So I think it's kind of multifaceted. Plus the fact, you've not got the kind of the wider workforce that we had kind of pre the referendum, a whole host of different issues. So supply and demand operating at the same time. And if Nick wants to pick up the transport one.
Yeah, I think the sort of it's difficult to untangle the kind of impact within the year from the kind of ongoing pressures that will result further down the line. But in simple terms, I think there's a number of different funding sources that have been made available to support buses in the short term over the COVID period, and some of those are still obviously continuing now. The underlying position is a £1 million plus problem, but because there's been money in the current year to support that, we've actually had more money in than kind of that underlying problem kind of exists, a level that it exists at. But going forwards, a lot of that one-off money will drop off, or we have to work on the basis that it will. Okay, there has been an announcement that suggests it might continue for a slightly longer period, which might mean that we're slightly in a better position in the short term. But going forwards, the underlying position is still that there's that big deficit in the kind of underlying difference between the budget availability and the resources.
So I'm just a bit just a bit concerned that what we're stating isn't consistent. So in the budget papers, we were saying we've got a major 1.2 million overspend, and yet this report is saying the net budget underspend is forecast to be 302. Presumably that is for this year. Yeah. And the MTFS is relating, as you're saying, to the ongoing period in future years, because I think that's an important distinction, because if you just read this, it's not immediately apparent.
If you take the 1.3 million pounds worth of extra funding out, then you'd be in a £1 million overspend position in the current year. So obviously projecting that forward, that's potentially going to grow 1.2 million or whatever going forwards. That's the sort of position.
Mr. Richardson.
Thank you, Chair. Mine really relates to almost a previous paper, in that I'm just trying to get my one grey cell around this. So if I understand what the government's done is they've said that where we have an SEN deficit, we effectively run it outside the balance sheet and almost off the book, because they expect that deficit to continue accruing. But presumably we still have to fund that deficit. So what is the lost opportunity cost to us of funding that deficit?
I can understand your difficulty getting your head around this because like I say, it's nonsense, to be quite frank. So what the statutory override does, and the statutory override I think came in about 3 years ago, and then they've now extended it for another 3 years. It allows local authorities to ignore the fact you've got a great big deficit on your balance sheet. Yeah. So you kind of don't have to fund it. You can just live with a deficit. Now that might sound like it goes against reality. Well, it kind of does. I mean, I always thought statutory overrides were there to kind of override bits of the statute that didn't make sense, not to kind of develop a parallel universe. But anyway, that's kind of where we've got to with it. So. But you're right, at the same time, we have spent that money. We've spent that money. It has gone out of our bank account and it's been paid to somebody else. So that deficit is being funded through our cash balances. In terms of accounting, it sits there as a negative balance that in theory, we kind of don't need to take account of it, but clearly we do because we spent the money. So it's a difficult concept to get your head around, and they should have brought this in. They really haven't. They brought it in when the deficits were relatively small because they were concerned about local authorities cutting other services to fund SEND. That's why they brought it in. And once you brought it in, it gets bigger and bigger, and they extended it for another 3 years because the impact of taking it away would have been too great. You've heard about £3.5 billion deficit. You know, in another 3 years' time, what's that deficit going to be? 7 billion. It just gets bigger and bigger, and it gets harder and harder to take away. So yeah. Now, I understand your difficulty.
I thought that's where it was, but I suppose it then leads to the other question of shouldn't we show that opportunity cost under the SEN budget line, so that when we're making our protest to government about funding SEN, it's not just funding the deficit, it's also funding the revenue we've lost over the years in funding the deficit, which we could have used for other things.
I mean, that is a good point, and we have even thought about in the past, because you're right, there's an opportunity cost that would have been sitting in the bank account earning interest, and it would have helped with our overall position. We have thought about kind of charging that interest cost to the deficit, but we can't do it, unfortunately. But I think it is something it is worth kind of pulling out that is a real cost. There's real cost, and there has been a bit of work done nationally. I can't recall the figure, but it's a huge figure, as you can imagine, when you're talking about £3.5 billion kind of being kind of lost in terms of interest on revenue balances on local authorities. But I'll have a think about how we can present it, because I think you're right. I think it does need pulling out.
Sorry, do you want to come in, Nick?
Just to add something to it as well. I mean, obviously the position that we've actually had to kind of reflect in our accounts is such that we are covering that deficit indirectly. If we didn't do that and took a different approach, then there's no doubt about it, the auditors would have been on our back straight away and said, well, you know, you've got a massive risk here as an authority, and that would be front and foremost of what they presented to you. So yeah, we've had to do what we've had to do to kind of cover it, really, despite the fact that the statutory overrides nominally does exist.
Thank you, Nick. Amanda.
Thank you, Chair. Earlier on in the papers, we talked about the risk to the authority, and Simon's already brought up the staffing recruitment challenges that we've got. Are we starting to see gaps appear in terms of service provision, and what risks does that hold out to us? I don't know whether or not this is the appropriate scrutiny, maybe something we could pick up at Highways, is also the relationship between the public bus service budget line that's there and the concessionary budget line as well, because obviously those do they not work in parallel, and they're obviously highlighted separately, but whether or not we could have a little, if you could just tell me how they play out together, that'd be really helpful. Thank you.
On the, I suppose, the risk around staff and recruitment, I think we're kind of managing it at the moment. But I mean, you just need to listen to the previous discussion we had around SEN and the pressures there. There are pressures. So you know, the pressures in SEN, I mean, it's hard recruiting accountants, never mind kind of social workers and what have you. So we're just about kind of managing it, but it is a big pressure. I'm not gonna deny it, and it's a pressure for everybody. We're no different to anybody else. Everybody's got similar pressures. So yeah, at the moment, kind of hopefully we can continue to just about manage it. In terms of the bus subsidy kind of budget and the concessionary travel, I was hoping we do treat them kind of separately. I mean, they are kind of treated separately. In terms of the spend on the concessionary travel budget, we kind of more or less on budget, I think, on that one. Nick, I'm looking at Nick.
I think we are more or less on budget, but clearly the two do interact, because one of the issues that happened during the pandemic was that obviously less concessionary fare holders were using the buses, so therefore that was less fare income for the bus operators who would claim that back from us. So actually they were claiming back less concessionary money, or they would do if we paid them on the basis of the numbers, but that they would have then said, well, we're no longer viable. So then they would have we ended up paying them at kind of pre-pandemic concessionary fare levels in order to kind of maintain their viability. Going forwards, whether concessionary fare levels kind of increase back up to pre-pandemic levels, I guess remains to be seen. But there is that interaction there, and it is quite complicated. But the concessionary travel, obviously, we keep it separately because it is very much a kind of sort of separate statutory responsibility. We want to be able to quantify that in isolation to trying to kind of work out in terms of subsidy, public bus subsidy, etc., which is very different. So it's easier to keep the two budgets separately.
Yes, just a very, first of all, point of information. We're talking about staff retention and getting staff. I do know that our process is too lengthy, too complicated, and for people who do need a job, they can't wait so long. And I think internally that might be something that really needs evaluating, because you have the same application process for a cleaner than you have for a director, and it is really difficult trying. Even union members have picked it up. It's a very, very simple question. My computer just picked up, but I think it will packed up. Was point 61 in relation to Lutterworth East. The JR is now completed, but what does it mean? We need to reprofile. And that is all I've got to say on.
Shall I try and pick those up? We do have different processes for different types of jobs. So for things like school food, I know we have kind of we've trialed a kind of more of a streamlined kind of process. So we are trying to do things in a slightly different way, because I do accept that you don't want certain jobs to go through a long convoluted process. So yeah, we are looking at, and we have done it in some areas in terms of how we can do it. And actually, things like school food, we did have a real issue around recruiting people to work in that service, and that has improved actually recently with a lot of local recruitment and kind of word of mouth and all the rest of it. So there are some things that we have done in specific services. And yeah, Lutterworth East, you're right. We now know that the NHS can't appeal. They're out of time. So we're now looking at the options in terms of what we can do with that issue and with that development. Clearly, since we set off on Lutterworth East, a lot of things have happened, not least the cost of construction has rapidly increased. So again, it's something we're looking at options, and we'll be bringing something back to members probably in the spring.
If I may come back, so nothing is going to happen until we reprofiled and looked at all of the options in the spring of this year.
We basically just need to reconsider the options, have a look at kind of what the costs are looking like. But clearly now we've got out of the position in terms of the legal challenge around Section 106. I think we can move forward on that. But I say things have changed considerably since we set off on the project.
Any other questions, comments from members? No. Okay. Nick, Chris, Mr. Brecken, did any of you want to make any final comment?
No, I think my only comment, Chair, would just be this is period 10. I think it has progressed since period 6, and we're obviously moving towards year end. So I'm sure when year end's here and we next present this, it'll be a closure. And I think some of the figures that we've dealt about when we're talking about over £400 million worth of spend, they are quite minor, but things do move and things do variance. But I think the questions you've asked are very good ones. But I think Chris has said that the last item on your agenda sort of highlights the scale of some of the problems that we're facing and what we're trying to do to address them. So,
thank you, and thank you to members for your questions, and Chris for your responses.
The latest forecast is slippage of £22 million, and that's obviously on a £124 million programme for the year. £5 million of the slippage relates to children's and family services, and that covers school places, the SEND programme talked about earlier, and also the social care investment programme. 0.6 million slippage in adults and communities. Again, the main element of that is the social care investment programme. E&T, there's 0.5 million net slippage, but that covers a combination of slippage and acceleration across a whole range of schemes. It's got a lot of detail in the appendix on that. 0.4 million slippage in corporate resources, and that's mainly around the workplace strategy and also on some of the climate change initiatives. And then obviously the biggest item of slippage is on the investing in Leicestershire programme across a range of schemes. And there's various reasons for that, but one of them is very much around the kind of ability to deliver schemes at a point when inflation is kind of rocketing and we're having to kind of look at costs, etc. And so that's the kind of main driver behind that slippage. That was the kind of summary. The only other bit on the report is around the overall investing in Leicestershire position as well at the end. Do you want me to pick that up now, and shall I just kind of briefly cover that? Okay, so yeah, that's the table in paragraph 64, which shows the position as at Q3. Overall, 5.9% in-year income forecast for directly held properties. On indirect holdings, it shows obviously only 2%, but it is actually much harder to kind of measure that in the short term as we don't get kind of regular returns in on those investments. That position will definitely improve as the private debt and the bank risk shareholdings provide returns further down the line. And then overall, the bottom line is a 3% return on income. But if you exclude the development area and you exclude the rural portfolio, then that increases to a 4.4% return. And then just a final point to make on it is that this doesn't include anything in terms of respect of capital appreciation, capital gains, because they're not included in this, and they will get calculated and assessed at the end of the financial year and built into that outturn position, as it were.
Thank you, Nick. Does anyone have questions on this part of the report? No. Okay. Any further comments, Nick, Chris? Reckon? Yeah.
I'll just make one, which is, I think overall this is pretty positive. If you'd have asked me kind of last summer or autumn, war in Ukraine started, inflation kind of taking off, the backdrop of the pandemic, that we were going to end up in this position, I'd have been really pleased. So I think it is a pretty good position given the year we just gone through.
Thank you, Chris. Any final comments? No. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for your contributions. The date of the next meeting of the Commission is scheduled to take place on Wednesday, the 12th of April at 10 a.m. I've been advised there are no urgent items, so that brings the meeting to a close. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance and participation today.
Thank you.